Mr.
Speaker, thank you. Mr. Speaker, some of us in this House have been long-standing citizens and parliamentarians, been involved in the practice of politics for a very long time, either sometimes successfully, other times unsuccessfully. Sometimes, Mr. Speaker, we unintentionally in politics hurt ourselves. We do things out of honor, out of sincerity, but there are unintended consequences. And we do not, as we make those decisions, properly understand that others may interpret our decisions in a certain way, and a range of consequences follow. Likewise, Mr. Speaker, there are moments when we take decisions intentionally. We know the consequences of the decision. We know what we will reap when we take the decision. And of course, there might be particular reasons why we take that route, hoping, notwithstanding what it inflicts, that there would be redemption at some point. But, Mr. Speaker, I prefer to dwell on those unintended consequences when unintentionally we hurt ourselves. Mr. Speaker, I listened to the member for Micoud South. I came in late but had an opportunity to listen to at least a significant section of his contribution. And the rather elaborate explanation that he has offered for escrow accounts. Now, Mr. Speaker, I would include the unintentional harm that we are imposing on ourselves by the amendment that was approved by the minister when number 48 of 2019 was enacted. You see, Mr. Speaker, the fact that you're going to establish an escrow account overseas and not within your own banking system clearly indicates that your banking system has issues, has problems. And anybody familiar with our banking system would know that our banks are under incredible pressure and incredible scrutiny. And what looms large, obviously, has been the legislation with extraterritorial effect imposed by the United States of America, and increasingly a very belligerent Europe, looking very closely at programs such as the CIP and, of course, other programs that we have had, for example, offshore financial centers. Therefore, no matter how you come with explanations of requirements of banks overseas, of the fact that banks are approved overseas, there will always be suspicion, always. And there's a fundamental question: who really is going to be monitoring those escrow accounts? To whom are these accounts liable, and who must cast an eye on those accounts? And what is the capacity of the local enforcement arms of the government to undertake that kind of assessment? These are the questions that we have to ask ourselves. Because try as we might, because we are dealing with remoteness, it is going to be exceedingly difficult, Mr. Speaker, to ensure the accountability that is required when these escrow accounts are established. In other words, Mr. Speaker, I spoke of unintentional pain, and that is classic. Because anybody assessing this legislation, the regulations, and the member for Castries South has spoken eloquently, will immediately be put on an inquiry. Why on earth is this government going overseas to establish escrow accounts so that it can benefit alleged investors? Why? Especially in this kind of environment. We may think that somehow we have a president in the United States who understands business, but as far as one is concerned, it's a matter of time, tanto tanto. But the reality is that we may not have thought through this as we should have, and I certainly believe that this needs to be reviewed and reconsidered, rather be enacted in these regulations. Mr. Speaker, you know, you are supreme when it comes to the interpretation of the rules in the House. And so it should be, Mr. Speaker. Obviously, we will have disagreements with you from time to time, Mr. Speaker, about your interpretation of the rules. And you know the rule, that if at some point there is genuine disagreement over how you interpret the rules, then one seeks interpretation elsewhere to know exactly what the rules mean. But, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to the interpretation of the law, it's a different matter. It's a very, very different matter, Mr. Speaker. And with due respect, Mr. Speaker, I had great difficulty in understanding your ruling in respect of Section 33 of the Citizens by Investment Act. And I'm not engaged, Mr. Speaker, in any exegesis to criticize you or to attack you. But I am speaking from the point of view of someone who had responsibility for introducing this legislation in Parliament, had the opportunity to witness debate and discussion of this legislation in the Cabinet of Ministers. And so I believe I have a different interpretation to you. Mr. Speaker, Section 33 says the St. Lucia National Economic Fund is established. 2. Qualifying investments of cash shall be paid into the St. Lucia National Economic Fund. And crucially, number 3, the Minister for Finance shall lay before Parliament every financial year for its approval the purposes to which the funds will be allocated. Now, Mr. Speaker, you cannot argue that this act is co-equal to the estimates of revenue and expenditure. Because it is co-equal, then if you cite what projects you have funded under the estimates of expenditure, then automatically you have made a declaration. That can't be so. Because this legislation clearly had a specific purpose, a specific intention. The fact of the matter is this. When the CIP was being introduced, there were genuine fears on the part of the government that it was so sensitive that we needed to have support on both sides for it. I am on record, Mr. Speaker, as expressing my grave disquiet, and if, when the time comes that I have to express what are the measures during my tenure that perhaps I may have introduced that I have regrets over, this one will qualify. And this is nothing strange. I have said so publicly. Even at the launching of the CIP, I expressed my reservations. No, but that's nonsense. You should know very well, and the speech is available. You can go and read it when it was delivered. He was there, hiding in a hotel room, but he was there when the launching.
Honorable.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. Yes, Mr. Speaker, I'll turn to you. Now, that being said, Mr. Speaker, it is very clear, Mr. Speaker, that the purpose was to make frank and full disclosure to Parliament about what the funds will be used for. That is why you have subsection 3. The Minister for Finance shall lay before Parliament every financial year for its approval the purposes to which the funds will be allocated. And the intention is to declare what the funds are, how much is in the economic fund, and how much of that you're going to spend and not spend. Now I understand the embarrassment of the Minister of Finance, because some of the money from the CIP has also been used for recurrent expenditure, which should have never been. It was never intended that the CIP funds be used for recurrent expenditure. But the whole objective was that a program of expenditure be brought to the House, and the House examine the program of expenditure and determine year on year whether, of course, by the majority or otherwise, by condemnation or otherwise, by bargaining or otherwise, what projects will be funded. So, Mr. Speaker, if in its wisdom the government decides that it's going to introduce new legislation to govern the National Economic Fund, it has its legislative right to do so, to use its majority to do so, notwithstanding the huge defects and defaults in the legislation. So it's up to them to have done so, but that does not negate the fundamental reality that the law in Section 33 was breached, because he had a responsibility to bring the objectives of expenditure to Parliament for Parliament to determine whether they approved it or not. This was never done. So is that a question that the proposal, the observations of the member for Castries South ought to be discarded? The fact that they have two laws that were co-equals is irrelevant. What matters is the intention of each specific law. So, Mr. Speaker, on that matter, you and I, despite my respect and high regard for you, you and I must take a separate path. Mr. Speaker, some time ago when I spoke on this matter, I warned the House about the future of the CIP. If we are thinking strategically, we have to make a determination of how much more time we have to administer this program. What is the lifespan of this program? Can it survive another 5 years? Can it survive another 10 years? If we come to the conclusion that this program has limited life, 5, 6, 7 years, then strategically it may make good sense to say, well, since this program has a very short lifespan, let us make as much use of it as possible and see how much revenue we can generate from the existence of the program. Now, I understand that language. I understand that kind of strategy. But it also calls for a certain level of honesty before the House to say, look, we better take that route because the omens are not good. Since that statement, Mr. Speaker, and I would urge the government to think carefully about this. Members of the European Parliament have now openly asked that the Schengen visas waived for persons in the Eastern Caribbean and elsewhere be reviewed in light of what is happening with the CIP programs. Now, so far, it's just a call. But that is always the case. It starts as a modest call, then balloons, and then is translated into open policy. We have to be alive and aware of the implications of these developments. And it is for this reason, as well as others, I think we have to tread carefully and be careful in this period that we do not end up engaging in actions that can undermine the very foundations of the program that we have. I doubt, Mr. Speaker, that the CIP in the Caribbean will exist in the next 8 years, if as long as 8 years. We have no time, but I believe that we are doing a great disservice if we continue to introduce regulations like the type we have debated this morning. That, I think, is very, very unfortunate. And all I do, Mr. Speaker, is to urge that we don't cause unintended damage in the program by enacting legislation of the kind that was done by number 48 of 2019. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I say no more.